Hello, friends. Those of you that might be joining me today, I welcome you and I'm grateful for your presence and your participation in this that I'm calling the Fellowship of the Mystery. And, one of the reasons that through the encouragement of friends like Michael, I've been encouraged to try to make this much more of a participatory uh, um, I won't call it an event, but activity uh, is one of the reasons that I've decided to, at least for the foreseeable future, to have live streams on Wednesdays. And so I'm not sure how many of you are out there. I'm still trying to learn kind of how to navigate through doing a live stream and being aware of um, people that are actually watching and to encourage you again, if you are one who is watching, that feel free. I need to share the let's see, share the link here so others can join us. See, Michael is coming on board now. Michael Leighty, so delighted that he's going to. Let's see. Yeah, still waiting. But anyway, just again, this is a time for just just discussion and hopefully genuine encouragement. Uh, I am a broken record in many respects, in many areas, or at least a few areas. And one would be that, if we understand all mysteries, but we do not have love, we're nothing. We're just a noisy thing. And so it is genuinely my prayer that by focusing the mind, the nous, as the Greek has it, the eye, as it were, upon Christ in spirit, that this will lead to transformation from the inside out, and not merely information, theological or otherwise, but that it would truly give us the opportunity to use Paul's word that I just love, translated from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where he talks about gazing. To me, that frames the entire Christian enterprise as one that is inherently mystical and contemplative. It means that we're paying attention. We're fixing, as Paul says, fix your eyes on Christ, and that your life is hidden with God in Christ. And so we lift our eyes, as it were, above the temporal, the external, the observable, which is not to denigrate or undervalue those things, but to put them in proper hierarchy, proper order, and to see that Christ is the one within, behind, beneath, above all of it. Christ is all and in all, and he fills everything in every way. So this is what I seek, rather falteringly, to endeavor each day to try to be appreciative of the sacrament of the present moment, which is the title of one of my favorite books on contemplative prayer. That every moment is sacred, and in some respects, everything is sacred in creation, and that we're given this opportunity to, by faith, see past the surface and into the depths of creation, and that it is all created in, by, and for Christ, and to encounter Christ in every event, which, as Thomas Merton said, these are seeds of contemplation, that everything basically that we encounter in our daily mundane life offers us an opportunity to go deeper in our relationship with Christ, and go deeper in our relationship through Christ with the Godhead, with God himself, with Abba, the Father, and with the Holy Spirit. who I do like to think of in some respects in feminine terms. Uh, I just I just intuit that's implicit in our in a lot of the language of Scripture. It's kind of a feminine perspective on the Holy Spirit, and so in some sense, what inevitably emerges is some kind of idea of a family, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that in this interrelationship, eternal relationship of perichoretic love, of the dance of love, that it is out of the overflow of that love that that we are given this gracious opportunity to always be in deep and real participation and connection with the divine, which is God. Um, so, anyway, we let me see. I need to check something here to see if some that I've invited initially are perhaps on uh, or trying to communicate with me through Discord or otherwise. But yeah, one of the things that this gives us an opportunity to do is um, to to go over the most recent presentation. Um, yeah, let me respond here quickly to Michael. And so, the idea being that hopefully, if you've taken time to watch and listen to my most recent presentation, that could be a topic of discussion. But again, I just want to say very clearly that if you have watched any content on my channel and you would like to participate in that you are welcome to ask questions or raise observations or even objections or whatever. I welcome that. Okay, I see Michael has been able to arrive after some technical difficulties. Hey, Michael.
Hey, how's it going, Wayne?
All right, how are you, man?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, great.
Uh,
I really appreciate you taking time to hang out with me for a few minutes today.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what anything particular on your mind that you'd like to just dive right into? Or
Yeah, I guess for me in this whole series, the thing that keeps kind of being hammered in my head or keeps bringing to mind every time I engage with and look at your like the content, what you're doing. I feel like the what this brings me to is an idea around on like that we just need a radical reformation of our ontology,
hmm,
and that we've pretty much all of us have come under the spell of modernity, and that it's so deep in the layers of our assumptions that it's again it's like it's the water we swim in. It's very difficult for us to sort of even disentangle. Even if we propositionally can start talking about it and pointing to it, it's still is so operative in most of our decision making and sort of our basic where our fundamental trust lies, and how we evaluate evidence or you know what we prioritize in our schemes of attention and so forth. So yeah, I think that's what I feel like is this is drawing me to the most.
yeah. What are some
I
specifics in terms of that ontology that you would unpackage?
well, Um, Specifically, I think the big thing is the connection between God and nature, or even more specifically that what's called the sort of grace nature divide, and that this has been, and really I can't. It's prior to the Reformation, but I think the Reformation kind of really sort of cuts deep in terms of sort of separating these things out,
Right.
where um, Paul on his channel has been talking about this book by a guy named what's his name? I can't remember his name. He's a Yale scholar. Has a very interesting book on the Reformation period, but more recently has a book on all these saints that actually physically flew, or at least there's all this, and he basically just, it's an interesting book because he's certainly coming within the postmodern, skeptical frame, but he's also applying this sort of skepticism to our modern assumptions about how the world works as well. So he's like,
Yeah.
if we take like a rigorous academic approach to these accounts of people flying, that were investigated rigorously by the church.
So you're talking about like levitation, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And just
Saints. Yeah.
and it is reading that as a modern person, and in the prologue, or the I don't know, maybe the introduction to the book, he talks about how he got down this path, and he was like basically touring some, I don't know, some saint site in Spain, and as they're doing the tour, the person's, just matter of factly telling all these details of the saint's life, and then the next sentence she's saying, oh, and here's the area where he levitated, and like, they just like something in his head kind of bust open at that moment, and like, and I think, he says that's kind of where the germ of this book was planted.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So it's not
so,
that he or we are encouraging a fixation on levitation per se, but just that the obvious, breaking
this
of a
juncture from our modern assumptions, and he
right.
particularly is picking on that as a means, because it's obviously, well, there's so many things that, like, what quote unquote miracles nowadays that we can come up with some actual explanation for, like, somebody has a sudden remission of cancer, like, well, there was something in their immune system finally got it right and took the cancer out, or like we can come up with sort of like rational explanations for it. He's like,
Right.
this is one where, like, there's no way, like, we don't have any way of explaining people flying, other than, like using, wires or things like that,
Right.
which in some of these instances, he centers on things where it would be very hard for, someone to fake these things. So,
Sure.
and he's like, well, what was it that led to these, these very, many accounts of this kind of thing. But
Yeah.
that's sort of a bunny trail. But it's like, I bring that up to say, like, we there are these sort of cracks in our modern assumptions about ontology are starting to form now, and something's going to have to fill into that gap as that thing kind of washes out. I think, there's a really good book by D.C. Schindler that we've talked about previously called Love in the Postmodern Predicament. And the sort of introduction of that book is him talking about what he calls a bourgeois metaphysics,
Mm.
which is sort of the baseline, I think, assumptions for modernity. And sort of what it is it's not even, he calls it a metaphysics that's not a metaphysics. It's sort of what it is it's sort of taking the methodological approach of science, where we within the realm of science, we sort of temporarily bracket out certain elements of reality on purpose,
Yeah.
to kind of limit the moving parts, so we can play these sort of games of, like, experiments and so forth. And it's been so useful that it's become sort of extended beyond that sphere of where it's actually practical and useful into all these other spheres where we sort of pretend that we're doing that.
Yeah.
but we're not really doing it. We're not really doing science anymore, but we sort of pretend we're doing it at these larger scales. And I think even like in some of the softer sciences, there's there's ways of trying to, by analogy, do the same thing. And I mean, there's a lot of incredible usefulness in like new ways of seeing the world, but it's also, by its very nature, it's sort of like, if you think about like either like a telescope or microscope, I think that's like the greatest analogy for what we're doing. It's like it gives us very high grain resolution, but in such a limited sphere of space that like to say that we can, it does it drastically inhibits our ability to see the larger picture. Yeah. You know, if we go back to your example from that previous video where you zoom into one little part of the picture, that's modernity right there. I think this is reality, and I think that is, it definitely infected the church and all of us in a deep way. And I think, something we're going to have to we're going to reinvestigate that process, which also involves a reinvestigation of all these quote unquote spiritual phenomenon, the hierarchies of angels and so forth. So I guess when you start, especially in your towards the end of your latest video where you're talking about the links between the law and the angelic powers and the cross, it's sort of questions in my mind start erupting about, there seems like a lot of what the apostles are writing about in the New Testament is trying to figure out what this new ontological paradigm is. Some radical change has been affected in the cross. And even Jesus talks about, with the disciples after he's arisen, that like it's better for he says it's better for the disciples that he goes to the Father, and that the Holy Spirit come. And there's like, in some sense, we're in this new age of the Holy Spirit. And I don't know what all that means, but I think whatever the church is going to be focused on, for the next bit, is gonna have to do with that. I also think this sort of, the grand philosophical question of our time that's being asked in different ways, is the theodicy question, like the issue of like, okay, how is it that a good God, allows all this destruction and mayhem? And I think this sort of sidestepping of that question has always been, atheism, materialism, which has been this sort of like way we've sort of put off that question, for the last like little bit, at least in the like the most intellectual, highly rigorous academic spheres where people should be probably most interested in talking about that. That's been, it's just kind of been blunted completely by atheism. It's all random. That's why that's why we see this, and I think that again with the new atheism was kind of the final overreach of trying to extend this scientific materialism methodology of bracking out metaphysics, and then like folks like Dawkins, for instance, try to extend that into a philosophical argument. It just falls flat. It doesn't, like, Dawkins is not a philosopher. It just starts, even people have made all these analogies. It's like, somebody that's an expert in one field just coming into something they're completely have no expertise in and pretending that they're like going to teach you something. And that's basically what everybody's now seeing, these new atheists, when they start trying to talk about philosophy, they're clearly, they're clearly missing something that's fundamental to almost all of our human experience. And so I think, answering this question about like, okay, well, how is it that, this fundamental beauty, truth, and goodness, at the source of everything, this fundamental unity, what's going on with all this sort of division and ugliness and all that we see now, like that that flies in the face of that. Like what's going on,
right?
And it does seem like there has to be some sort of in accounting for that, there has to be some explanation that points to, these angelic powers or these spiritual hierarchies or something like that. Because like, even if you're going to be like, a sola scriptura Protestant Christian and read the Genesis account real literally and be like, okay, well, Adam and Eve, they fell in the garden. That's caused this cosmic disorder that we see. It's like, okay, well, but what about the snake that's there before they like that convinces these naive, so sort of almost infantile
Yes.
children that don't know good from evil into taking these very tottering steps towards rebellion against the divine order. That's your explanation for how everything falls apart. It's like
Right.
it doesn't really, even in that reading doesn't just hold water. And I think
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
there's a lot there to be. Sorry, I've been kind of rambling across a lot of
Yeah.
different subjects, but hopefully you feel the connection to what you've been talking about.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's again, it's kind of like as words maybe can only be but gesturing toward the truth. When I say that, reappreciating Colossians 1, for instance, that all things are created in Christ, by Christ, and for Christ. It is a radical reframing of the relationship, the ontological relationship, the metaphysical relationship between Christ and creation. And it's something that I think that in subtle ways that we fall prey to some systematic theologies that want to at least implicitly stress an alienation between Christ and creation, or God and creation, that winds up being more deistic than truly Christian. So, yeah, I totally agree. Um,
Well, and you can also see how it's not hard to see how deism leads directly to atheism. Once you've bracketed God to the side, you get to this place where like, oh, we don't need it. We don't need, there's nothing, there's no real interaction other than these quote unquote supernatural things. Which
right.
it is funny how, I don't know. It's we suddenly lose this ability to even talk about this supernatural stuff. It all gets pushed into this corner where we don't talk about it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of an embarrassment, I guess, to some people. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Did you, just out of curiosity, did you get a chance to listen to the that David Bentley Hart last lecture that I sent
I
your way?
did. I did.
Yeah.
I wanted to raise that as it seems to me it connects with what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your
Well,
thoughts on that?
well, one of the points he points out here, and I've heard him say this much elsewhere. Like I can't remember what patristic father he points to, but basically this person says like if you take away like what is a man, in what ways are we fashioned after the image of God? He says, well, if you take away the soul and body, what's left is the spirit, and in some sense the spirit is. And he talks about David Bentley Hart had done a translation of the New Testament. I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that. It's fairly recent, but one of the big footnotes in that book is, anytime he's translating the word spirit in Paul's writing, he makes the point. It's very clear that it's very difficult for him to say in some senses whether he's talking about like a man's spirit, God's spirit, some other kind of spirit, and
Right.
in some sense he makes the point that Paul doesn't seem to feel the need to distinguish because in some sense it's all of the same stuff,
Yes.
um, which again I to me in some sense seems right,
Hmm.
um, and how he says our ideas of God creating ex nihilo and these theology of emanation as well, like they seem to be in some sense the same thing, where like God in some sense is creating out of nothing, but what he's creating with in some real sense is himself, his breath brought into this, into this created order. But then again, that raises all these other questions. Okay, so if God is so intimately connected, if our ideas around the alienation have been so wrong, it brings you back to the point I was bringing up earlier. Well, say, where was the dramatic left turn? What happened? And and what role do we have and the gospel have in making that right and reconciling it?
Right. So our participation, both in some sense platonically as well as in other ways, as the offspring of God, the children of God, is important to our Father. So I wondered, though, particularly, I wanted to ask you to see if, and I just want your honest feedback on this, and trying to come to understand what David Bentley Hart is saying, and I guess also just to add a footnote to our discussion in contrast to Jordan Daniel Wood, which I may have a little more familiarity with, but I still don't think I really understand well enough hardly to comment on it. But it seems to me that that David Bentley Hart in that last lecture that isn't it called the Stanton Lectures, I think?
Yeah.
And it's on his channel. I think it's Leaves in the Wind, I believe is the name of his channel. I think.
It's unfortunate. The audio is absolutely poor.
Yeah.
It's Stanton Lectures is like something annually put on by the University of Cambridge.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of like really, prestigious, folks that have given that in the past. And it's kind of baffling that they have this audio situation that's so bad for this, but
as well as the video owl, I think you called it. But
I'm not sure. Yeah, the audio situation, along with my own, I'm not theologically trained, so a lot of the the technicalities of language, I know one of the things that comes up is like this idea of real relations from Aquinas and stuff that goes back to Aristotle and such. I don't like that's.
Right.
It's technical language that exceeds my, I did have like a undergraduate, sort of biblical theological training, but it was like, from a Pentecostal school that was in some sense very more forward looking than backward looking at, these theological debates from the past. They were more concerned around things around like, pneumatology and, what, their specific theological teachings around the baptism of the Holy Spirit and such. So but so I like all that to say I'm my opinion is amateur at best, but it seems like the disagreement between the two, and again I hesitate to even call it a disagreement because like he does say from the outset that he believes that he really enjoyed Jordan's book and recommends it and so forth. But he seems to have this thing where he thinks that Jordan Daniel Wood talks about the incarnation as sort of this miracle of these two incommensurate things being united and
a third thing that emerges in a sense through the hypostatic union. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, like there's some sort of like disjunction between the two that and Dave Bentley Hart wants to affirm more that there's something much more where like that the incarnation is like a sort of hand in glove thing where the two things like it's just the source being united to its origin. There's nothing sort of miraculous and dramatic about it, in fact that it's sort of the human life that Jesus leads is not in some way. There's not some like physically material separation between that being open to all humans. In some sense, that is, and more generally that is the actual horizon or terminus for all humanity.
Right.
Which I think Jordan would agree with that as well. Like that theosis is the what we are all called towards and are on a path towards. So and I was sort of primed to be, just because I've seen a lot of Jordan's like online stuff, and he just seems like a very, very intelligent, and also I don't know, he's just very likable individual. So I was sort of primed to be like on his side more than David's, given that he's a lot more prickly and can just seem I don't know. I've really enjoyed all his work, but sometimes at times it seems like he can go out of his way to be a little bit I don't know, dramatic, So I thought maybe this was him like picking, but it seems the point he brought up seemed to me worth bringing up, and I felt like if I understand it, I as much as I understand it, it seems like he's making valid points.
So it may be in some respects more a difference over emphasis as opposed to fundamental um, metaphysics. But I wondered if you think that in some sense, I listen. You shared with me your thoughts through a voice file,
Mm-hmm.
audible file, audio file, whatever. And I listened to that a couple of times, and really thought your reflections were very insightful and helpful to me. But it seems to me that in talking about the transfiguration, which is one of the things that he talks about in that lecture, that he's trying to say that that there's a deeper unity that manifests through the transparency, as it were, of Christ. This glory that's shown through his very physical being, in some sense. So that I don't know. I guess one of the main things I want to ask you, if you think that he's saying, or at least implying, is it has having something to do with what I call, and I'm certainly not unique in this, but I call the eternal humanity of God, or the
Mm-hmm.
eternal humanity of Christ. That that that, and I do think that you know he mentions Bulgakov, which I know next to nothing about. I must admit, but I know a little, probably enough to be dangerous to say anything about it. But I do read in a lot of the Russian Orthodox sociological theologians. There seems to be this thing about the humanity of God, the eternal humanity of God, in some sense, which of course has to be very qualified. We don't want to be misunderstood. It is a profound mystery, even though we may know something about it through revelation and intuition. But in other words, all that said to say that I kind of felt like that's part of what he was emphasizing, as over against just kind of framing the incarnation as that event in history where God and man comes together, in space, time, and history. Uh, but that instead there is this eternal backdrop, if you will, and reality, maybe in sort of more of an archetypical realm, the logos, etc. That even like Jewish Kabbalah has the Adam Kadmon which I'm not saying it's a one-on-one idea, but it is, to me, kind of similar in some respects, that that the Son of Man, as Jesus calls himself, and the Son of Man who appears even in appearances in the Old Testament, seems to have a pre-existent reality, as it were, to the incarnated Jesus Christ. But yeah, and I'm probably just going off on all kinds of bunny trails, but I say all that to say that to me there is this there is this eternal idea and reality, not just an idea in the mind of God, but reality of some kind where the human and divine, and therefore the creature and the creator, uh, uh, you know, there is this relationship, and that creation is not just an idea that God came up with one day and thought, I think I'll make a man in my image or a human being in my image.
Mhm.
That's something much more deeply rooted in the very heart
Yeah,
and being of God,
absolutely.
and that we're to be fearfully and wonderfully made goes beyond anything we can probably really conceive. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I think what the sort of issue, in some sense, what you're bringing up to the way I read it, to kind of put it into like a larger context, is like it's the same issue where you know atheism or all these modern strains of spiritual but not religious want to have a sort of blind cosmic force. And C.S. Lewis talks about this a lot too, right? Where he talks about we're fine with like some kind of benevolent force in the distance that kind of, but the idea of person, the idea of a thing that has desires and opinions and could come and tap you on the shoulder, and is a witness to you, the good, bad, and ugly of your life and your decisions and so forth, and actually cares about those things in some deep way, is in some sense very attractive to us, but also it's sort of like too much to bear, so we kind of push it to the side. But I think this eternal humanity is a way of kind of trying to give us a lens or a way of understanding the personhood of God, which is it's such a big, it's such a hard topic to break off. But you know, I think there is something very profound when Jesus is telling the disciples that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That somehow in the visible finite human, that there's some capacity or capability of a full representation of the hidden invisible Father. That's there's something there to be unpacked, I think, and it is I think, again, to invite us into some personal relationship
Mm-hmm.
with him. But it's funny, you have a lot of these recent revivals, always in some sense often try and pull us back into sort of that personal, making a personal interaction or relationship with the divine. But then they seem to kind of falter because there's still this baseline assumption of something more of where, again, where the separation between God and nature, and sort of the fundamental otherness of God in our ontology, that makes it so that we come to believe that personal interaction is sort of like in our heads, that it's just sort of make believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like kids believing in Santa Claus,
All right.
rather than some real deep interaction between us and God.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Hmm. I'm having a senior moment, so forgive me.
No, I'll while you're pondering, I'll bring up something else that I found interesting. Like at the
Yeah.
very end of your most recent video, where you brought up what is it? It was a quote. It was the quote from you have the quote reading from the Planet Narnia,
Hmm.
where and for whatever reason it never really occurred to me. I mean, obviously the stone table in Narnia has some direct connections to the law.
Yes.
Because he talks about it's carved into the stone, as deep as a spear,
Yes.
and that's broken by the resurrection of Aslan
Hmm.
is really interesting. I'd never really connected like that. I mean, I'm sure I was aware of it, but I just
Yeah.
when listening to the quote again, that you just see how the pains C.S. Lewis is taking to make sure that this is like really leaps out in the imagination
Hmm. Yeah.
about this connection between the law, which is a sort of superficial representation of a much, and it has its own glory, right? Because
Mhm.
it's put in place by the angels, and it
Sure.
has its own, sort of from a human perspective, very glorious, um,
Yeah.
genealogy, so to speak. But then it is superseded by some deeper magic that
Yes.
and again, C.S. Lewis is taking great pains to say it's in the fabric of the reality itself. It's not like some superfluous, magic fairy dust grace added. It's
Right.
woven into the world,
Yes.
and the ways he makes that clear in the way that the witch is talking about this, and her limited understanding of it,
Yes.
which also makes it also it's interesting too that like this idea of Satan having some sort of rightful ownership, which
Right.
is kind of lurks in the background of Christian thought, but it's not really made explicit in the Bible, but it's definitely there.
Yes.
And even the sort of fear that the pagan world has of the powers and principalities, that was very palpable,
Mm.
that kind of gets dispersed by the Christian light as it crosses the world. And
Right.
in some sense, like you couldn't have atheism without that disbursement, because I mean it was a palpable felt interaction that people had, that these spiritualities were having tangible impacts in their lives. So
Right.
I don't know.
Mm.
It's I don't know if that stirred up anything interesting for you, but
Yeah. Well, I do the, the day it just sort of occurred and dawned on me the depths to me of what Lewis was in some respects hiding within that story are just so profound. It just really amazed me, but in a way it shouldn't. That's what the whole book Planet Narnia is about. Uh, you know,
right. It's not even just a world. It's this larger cosmology of you
yeah,
know that he goes into detail in like the discarded image, but like yeah, like of like actual this connection between there's sort of like a one-to-one mapping between the angelic hierarchies and the even the movements of the natural world,
yes,
that we just don't we don't like we there's this sort of flattening that happens in modern thought, where even now like in Christian imagination, like we have this very like it's like we there's us and Jesus and God, and then everything else is kind of like just
yeah,
it's just cast to the side, and it's like
but
okay, well, what there's some role that all these hierarchies are still playing, and we
yes,
just don't really understand. We don't
yeah,
have any sort of conceptual understanding of it.
yeah, yeah, and I think just it just is so strong to me that in our sort of evangelism and presentation of the gospel that it's basically the only three agencies involved are like God the Father, God the Son, and us. And we stand condemned and the Son has to, in a sense, pay for us, be our substitution, and pay the Father's justice, as it were, or maybe you could frame that in terms of law, but I don't. Although some, like Ray Comfort, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's of the belief that you have to present the law when you present the gospel. You have to present the law first, and that's what he does. He basically convicts and convinces the person he's witnessing to that they have, they've lied, they've murdered, they've stolen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he can present the gospel kind of notion. But to me, it's like what is, I think, although there are very few scriptural references to it, but they're not only in Paul, they're also like in Hebrews and elsewhere. This has a lot more to do with these powers, principalities and powers than we imagine. And and that baffling, Paul has many baffling verses, but one is in Ephesians. I think it's Ephesians 4, where he says, all this is happening to show to the angels the manifold grace, or to show the principalities, the manifold, multicolored grace of God, or wisdom of God. That's what
wisdom of God. Wisdom.
So,
I was thinking about that verse as well. I think you mentioned it in your last video. You think, what is it? Yeah, and the verse in, what is it, 1 Peter, where he talks about how angels long to look into this mystery, and like there's something about it is hidden for them.
Yes. And that if they had known this, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Which, of course, you have. One question that immediately occurs to me there is, well, why wouldn't they have crucified him? Is it because they would have recognized and acknowledged him, or is it because they would have realized that in doing this, they're sealing their own fate in some sense?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure which it is for sure. But yeah. We have a comment here from James Barksdale, just tuned in, regarding the eternal humanity of God. I'm reminded of Acts 17, that in him we live and move and have our being. There is a mystical union of divine and human. I totally agree. And but a lot of theologians want to distance Paul from anything that they consider mystical, but I just think it's inevitable. And but
David Bentley Hart actually quotes that from that verse many times in the latest Stanton series.
Yeah. Yep. It just strikes me sometimes how this one little verse, which is a quote from a pagan poet who's talking about Zeus in its context.
Yeah.
This one little verse, there's no telling how many volumes, in some sense, in one way or another, have been written positively about that verse. And yet at the same time, I also think it's largely ignored in some ways, as far as taking it seriously, that we have our being in God and that we are all his offspring. Another quote,
Well, I think, I mean, again, and this gets back to the whole ontological discussion thing, where I think we have neglected ontology. Like, I think if you, if we were actually looking at these things seriously, we'd have to come to something like that conclusion, I mean, there has to be something sort of upholding our existence. It can't just be we're sort of like this whole sort of like, again, the deistic understanding of the nature kind of being created separate from God and sort of being wound up like a clock and just like set to go on its own. I don't know. It doesn't.
And it is, I mean, it's the metaphysical underpinning of the larger ultimate perspective of God's plan, purpose, and intentions. It's like it is the from him, through him, and to him. It is the Exodus Reditus. So instead of God just creating these separate beings and then throwing them out into the world, as it were, and saying, "Let's see what you do," and
Yeah.
and if you mess up, I'm sorry, you're a goner. You know, that that is so distant to me from the fuller vision of who God is and our relationship to Him that grounds everything else, the rest of the story of the prodigals, you know, who cannot escape their true identity no matter what they do. But yeah,
Yeah. And it's this yeah, because we don't have a proper metaphysical ontological structure, it what happens is it necessarily sort of limits where the how we do a theology as well. Like where we're like and in my experience, it leads to, you know, sort of Christianities that become very focused on just what happens in church on Sunday, you know,
yes,
because there it like there's again this sort of larger cosmos doesn't matter. It's sort of again going to get you know vaporized, and you know we're going to escape from it, rather than what I think is a better reading of the eventual union between heaven and earth, and that you know there's a sort of restoration of all things that extends to the physical order itself, you know, there, which is why, you know, again, the creation is in longing, you know, for the sons of God to be revealed, such that this can be, so that it can be released from its bondage as well.
right, yeah. Which, you know, to me, it just makes me think, kind of gets me back to, you know, love in the postmodern predicament. Um, there's something very, very liberating about this perspective that to me is key to really acting in love. And I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but you know, to me, one of the key psychological psyche being the soul. So this is not just psychobabble, but one of
Mm-hmm.
the key psychological uh, truths and dynamics is we have a great difficulty in loving other people if we're all worried about ourselves. If we're just consumed with worry and anxiety, existential anxiety, or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
it's like the thing I repeat often is I learned this from an old guy, um, almost pretty much a fundamentalist, but um, but he taught love in terms of relaxed mental attitude. He used the acronym RMA. You know,
Hmm.
he kind of equated the two. And it's like that just really struck me one day that there's really some deep truth there, and that if we're anxious for nothing, if we're content, then we're much more free to just let the love of Christ flow through us into the lives of others. We don't have to be anxious about them or about ourselves, and we know that they are
Yeah.
beloved by God beyond imagination, and so we don't have to try to rescue them, as it were. We just prayerfully seek to be channels of His love and His affirmation and His truth, and speak that truth, which is ultimately a person and not a proposition, into their lives, and just love.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's a great point. I there was a long time ago, my parents, like, who are very Pentecostal and sort
yeah,
of their origins. I grew up in the Assemblies of God, and they've always been in kind of those kind of circles. Even after they've moved away from Assemblies of God, they've been always more in like charismatic kind of
yeah,
churches and so forth. But I remember my mom gave me this book by Derek Prince, who is I think he British? I think but
I think so.
very, yeah, early, you know, Pentecostal teacher. And the book was called Blessing and Cursing, basically talking about the power of language, and that in some sense we're always sort of coming into agreement with you know, blesses or curses over the other, you know, the people in our lives.
Right.
And so we're always, in some sense, kind of pushing people towards or away, um, the what their actual, telos is, or calling within God. Um, and um, yeah, I think it's we have much more. I think this is sort of like part of what creation and the freedom we're given in it to either rebel is so we can sort of learn, what the kind of impacts we have, and I do think, especially like oftentimes the reasons why we are critical of other people, vocally critical, is as a means to justify ourselves, because we know so deeply of our own failings, and we feel such a huge gap between what we actually do and what we should do, and so we to have a more favorable comparison,
Yeah.
we kind of want to chop other people off at the knees, so we feel, by comparison, a little bit better.
Right.
um, and and coming into this fuller realization of, again, our loving acceptance that the price has, for this has in some sense already been paid in full, even if it has to be, worked out in our own life through sometimes, fear and trembling and all that accompanies the process of transformation, which was, let's be frank, is often, is painful, but in some sense it is accomplished, you know and it is weird how like how the church tries to avoid Pelagianism in all these ways, but often still ends up right back in that, there's always some methodology where it's on you to earn it, buddy,
Yeah.
um and
True.
it's because we don't there is we don't, again, have an ontology of the kind of this love that undergirds every, particle of existence, and even matter itself,
Right.
um, that that is acting on our behalf.
Yes. One of the people that I've come across in the last, it's been a while since I've watched any of his video presentations or anything, but it is the author of The Shack, Paul Young. Uh, he he talks about it. Just had the phrase, and of course I just lost it. Left, but he talks about the truth of our being, and he contrasts that, of course, with the lies that we believe both about ourselves and about God. But he even explicitly uses the word ontology. So I was really grateful to hear Paul. Probably it's been at least a year ago that I heard Paul Young talking about that. And but I'm not surprised because I think it's implicit in his book, The Shack. Have you ever, not putting you on the spot, but did you ever get to read The Shack?
I'm trying to remember if I did.
Yeah.
What year did that come out? That was like in the early aughts, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
It's
remember. I think when I was in school, people talked about it, but I can't remember if I ever read it or not.
yeah. It's a good
Um,
book, at least in my opinion. A lot of people hate it because you know he makes God a woman, and
yeah,
but God appears to the main protagonist in the novel as a woman because he couldn't handle God appearing as a man or as a father
yeah.
at first, and then God later in the book appeared. Those sorts of little things that people pick apart and don't like, but overall, I really feel like Paul Young has, again, in my opinion, a pretty good
Yeah.
grasp of the good news. That it's unconditional good news. It's just good news, and
Did
and that comes across in The Shack.
Did you ever watch the movie version of it? I'm
Oh
curious
yeah,
if it holds up to the book.
yeah, I've seen it a couple of times. Of course, they're never as good, never, rarely ever as good as the book, but Yeah, I would say it's not as good as the book, but it's still good. I think it communicates the message pretty
Yeah.
strong and clear, and does about as good a job as it probably could in terms of making into a movie. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I, 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 I don't think I read it, but I think, again, like that, this word on, ontology, I think, again, what the thing that the bourgeois metaphysics does is it's not that it gives us a new metaphysics, but it sort of convinces us by degrees that any efforts in that area are sort of wasted time.
hmm,
And so what it does, it kind of encourages us to avoid some of our deepest questions. It like purposely kind of says, okay, you're not doing something scientific or meaningful or knowledge and life producing over once you get into this little area. So don't do it. But
right,
what that does, it just leaves us trapped in with this, because what your ontology is just ultimately how you believe things actually are at their deepest levels, right?
yeah,
So you're going to have opinions about that either way,
right,
and whether you examine them or not, if you don't examine them, you're just going to be, again, you're going to imbibe it
right,
from the broader culture.
yeah,
It's going to be implicit, and in some sense even that much more powerful because you don't have propositional, conscious ability to interrogate it,
right,
and
yeah,
that's sort of like, C.S. Lewis again talks about this sort of spell of materialism.
yeah,
Going back to the Derek Prince thing about that sort of power of language.
mm-hmm.
And one of C.S. Lewis's great essays, I think, is "The Way to Glory."
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, towards, I don't know, maybe the sort of the climax of the essay, he says something like, "Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell on you?" And he says I am, but it's like because we've been under this great spell of materialism for so
Yeah,
long that we need a return of a real magic to awaken us from that
right,
slumber.
yeah, 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 and a couple things. One to me is that is that in a sense we can buy into the bourgeois more readily because maybe it appeals more to just kind of our superficial appetites and desires. And we're, as he says in that great essay, we're far too easily pleased, you know, making mud
Yeah,
pies as when a vacation by the sea is offered to us. And that's the thing to me is that I think people, and I think it's, if principalities and powers come to play in all of this in terms of a spiritual warfare, they want to keep us in the blind that
yeah,
that this stuff that of real Christianity is just all spiritual. It's otherworldly. It's asceticism or whatever. When to me, what is one of the great open secrets of Christianity is it's about incarnation. It's about being material. It's about being
yeah,
enfleshed and incarnated and being fully human and not non-human, not an angel. And so to me, it's like when we experience the glory of that reality, and whether it be in a sunset or the kiss our little girl gives to us going to bed before she goes to bed, or just whatever the many other little ways and moments, even in watching a movie where we find ourselves weeping because we've been touched by something that's really deep and real. Uh, that 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 that's all about what it means to be human, and what God wants us to be.
yeah,
Kind of what I think you were implying. I think you were mentioning. I can't. It could have been somebody else I was talking with this morning. I'm sorry, but it was like the idea is that it's an old rabbinical story. I think that when man stands before God, God's great disappointment is that you didn't be more of you.
yeah,
You weren't who you were meant to be. You aspired to be somebody else or something else. And so to me, it's that ontology. It is not just some sort of raw, real connection, but it is imbued with all the meaning of what it means to be made in the image of God. And to me, there's, in a sense, there's no end to that. It's bottomless in terms of its wonder and glory and beauty. So we need to become more incarnate. We need to become
Yeah.
more flesh, in a sense, in the best sense of the word, more infleshed, pouring ourselves out. The kenotic idea of, just finding ourselves by losing ourselves in some sense, and loving, those around us and the things around us and the animals around us and so forth and so on, more deeply into that, instead of ethereal, floating off into the netherworld.
Yeah. It's interesting. This incarnation idea, like I think you is struck on, like in the connection between, because again, we tend to, there's this sort of, I don't know, feel that like and I think this is in the secular culture too, that there's a sense of like, there's always this sense of illusion, like that the physical stuff is always hiding some deeper reality, that like, and that we don't see those two things intertwined.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I feel like why part of why the bourgeois metaphysic is attractive and seductive is it promises shortcuts to knowledge and power and transformation. Mm-hmm. Like there's this sort of idea that you can kind of do the math and get to the quote unquote right outcome ahead of everybody else. So right. we sort of believe in these very kind of black and white, overly simplistic, quote unquote right answers that can be scientifically determined, which when you're talking about the guy that stands before Jesus or God and it was not himself, in some sense, a lot of times why we pretend to be other things is because we think there is some quote unquote right answer that's so bland and uninteresting, and we've got to like form our tangible, flesh with all its weirdness and idiosyncrasies. We got to like cram them into this box of quote unquote rightness, and that's what it looks like to get ahead or be correct or be smart and respected, etc. And yeah, it's there's so much denial of the fundamental deep physical substance of who we are, and all that is entailed with that.
Yeah. Do you sometimes, though, get a glimmer of hope? It's like with respect to this video I shared with you recently. I can't remember. Oh, me. I'm telling you. This video I shared with you, and I'm trying to find the guy's name. Hold on just a second. I do want to get his name right. Yeah, here it is. It's Todd Desmond. And he has written a book called Psyche and Singularity. And I don't know. I just wanted to ask you, isn't there, in some respects, and you hear very different opinions amongst even the scientific community, there seems to be, at least implicitly, a great divide, but at least part of these men and women that are scientists, physicists, what have you, it's almost like they're saying we have hit a wall, and that wall, in some respects, we know is, I don't know, I probably shouldn't call it a wall. Well, maybe we've hit a door and it feels like a wall. We can either walk through it or we can just run into it and bounce back, and that is kind of, that quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And I know I probably only understand enough to be dangerous, but I do think I've been trying to think and listen and read about this for years. And I think I understand enough to conclude that, there's some really weird stuff going on that just is so, in a way, counterintuitive and counter to this purely rationalistic reductionism that wants to say everything can be accounted for, in terms of its quantity, basically, as opposed to the quality that seems to be there. But yeah, like the observer, the requirement of the observer, consciousness That's what's popping up everywhere that,
Yeah.
that I'm listening to. And it's like, you can't account for this by mere emergence out of non-consciousness. And it's almost like science it has the opportunity at least to lead us into this deeper metaphysics.
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. I mean, I think anybody that's doing real science, is going to get pulled, down that path,
Yes.
So like I think it's just like the inability of like what you're talking about earlier, where we kind of hit this wall. I think is definitely going to lead to something new. My only concern is like is the transition going to be incredibly chaotic? Is the old vessel we are in modernity going to have to be completely smashed into pieces
Yeah.
for that transition? And I'm hopeful that there's something, for, especially our kids' sake, that doesn't, it's a less chaotic transition. But
Right.
it's, the cracks are there, like whatever, it's coming apart. The question is, can we, yeah, and that's going to lead to all this, like you said, an explosion of weirdness that we've been keeping at bay.
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
and it's going to be exciting, but it's also going to be, people are going to, it's going to
Right.
be for people that really held closely to like, um, these overly simplified dogmas. It's gonna kind of blow their socks off, I think.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but there was Luke on one of his live streams. I think it was over the weekend, maybe.
Yeah.
It was fairly recently. Was talking about, he made a sort of offhand comment about that the most impactful, culturally moving conversations, over time have always occurred in sort of like very private, small groups.
Yeah. I heard him say that.
And yeah, and that I found that really interesting because it made me realize to some extent, just think about this at a sort of basic ontological level. There is, in some sense, no real generativity without union, without sort of the intimacy and trust and love that allows things to really come together and unite, and kind of like, and that's the only place where we see really new things come to light. And so I think I do think this scientific approach, this overly methodological,
Yeah.
way of perceiving reality has kind of is sort of, again, cut off all the weirdness and idiosyncrasies of people's experience. They've had to cut that off to even be a part of the conversation, which always is, which necessarily leads to a lack of intimacy. You can't really know people unless you kind of hear about all that kind of weirdness of people's personal experience and the challenges they're facing, and how they got to where they are and all that stuff. That's not extrinsic to their ability to be creative and have ideas, and like it's yeah. So I do think this, like, these new modes of communication that are much more personal, much more like, there's a lot more on a one-to-one basis, conversations happening. I don't, to what extent, like, can these virtual spheres actually produce real intimacy and so forth? I don't know, but I do think they're sort of, they're modeling, they're setting something up. Like, in some sense, it's a lot harder in these spheres to communicate. But I don't know. There's definitely, I definitely see possibilities for like new modes of, like, cultural interaction in the future
Yeah.
that are being figured out, or being kind of like, there's a lot of play and new kind of forms being birthed. So
Right. Yeah. I think it's intriguing, and please don't let me keep you beyond your time, Michael. I'm gonna close this down pretty soon, but And I do want to say thanks to James and Rick for joining us and for your comments. I did. I just wanted to, let's see, what is it that I wanted to say? I've completely forgotten. I don't know if it would come back to me or not. But yeah. Oh, I know what it was. That it's intriguing. The idea is intriguing to me. That it's kind of caused me. All of this has caused me to sort of revisit, at least probably on a superficial level, again, the whole notion of natural theology. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
what does God reveal in nature? Okay, and I think the tendency, at least I think, sort of again in a subtle way, the tendency is almost to reduce natural theology. And of course, people like Karl Barth, it's like they just totally reject natural theology. It's like the gospel is so
Yeah.
other. It's got nothing to do with
Yeah.
what you think or how you think God may have revealed himself in the world. But I totally disagree personally. And one reason is because of this discussion we're having, because I think they're much more
But
closely.
I think part of why that came to be a thing is
Yeah,
because our scientific investigation of the world also reduced the weirdness and strangeness of the natural order as well.
yeah, yeah.
With these quote unquote law, we see the natural world in this sort of very limited frame as well. So
Yeah,
it's of course like if it's like, oh yeah, this doesn't line up with the gospel, but
right.
yeah, but if we like I do think as we have a more fuller like understanding of like how incredibly strange and beautiful and wonderful the world is, we'll also see, okay, this is also revelation. But and it's funny, like the only reason science got kicked off in the Western world was this, I mean, this strong desire to kind of know the mind of the creator in a more deeper way,
Right.
you know.
Yeah,
Um
yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. That's interesting, and I agree, and I think it is because we were basically engaged in and embracing only Newtonian physics, and we were only concerned with cause and effect. So natural theology basically became just, in a way, a proof for the existence of God. It was almost like that was its total concern, and
mhm.
it was therefore just kind of concerned with cause and effect. Well, but here's my supposal, or my proposal is the possibility that God in his time, for this day and for this age, as we pressed further into the quote scientific realm, we're running into this wall or this door, and that in God's providence, he's like saying, "Oh, you thought you understood this." And it's like there's this door of opportunity to press into the most confounding thing in all empirical science, as it were, if you could sort of enclose consciousness in that, because it's almost inherently non-empirical, but absolutely the most obvious fact of our existence. We couldn't do
Yeah.
science without consciousness, that sort of thing. But that God, in some sense, is opening up the mystery, the deeper magic, if you will, of the quote physical world, which, as it turns out, is not just physical, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, to me, again, it's just this opportunity, and I see glimmers and signs of it, like Michael Levin in his study of morphology and things
Mhm.
like that. It's like there's something more going on here than just chance and randomness and and just particles floating around and aggregating by. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like natural theology needs to be upgraded to natural theology 2.0, so that we're not just concerned about cause and effect. We're concerned
Yeah. Well, I think
a deeper way
it's
about relationship, because I think that's one of the things implicit in that.
well, I think the reason, you know, Peterson had the effect he's had is because he's doing that effort of trying to marry up, science and art, the artistic endeavor, and religion. He's trying to bring these things that have been kind of separated into some sort of communion with each other. And there's something about us that knows that has to be true. Like you cannot have, the true, the good, and the beautiful separated. They don't, on when they stand alone, they lose their persuasive like ability for us to make sense of reality. And that we find it incredibly attractive when people are pulling those things together. Like that's in some like deep resonant place within us. We know that's interesting.
Yeah.
In a way that those endeavors alone are not.
Right.
So
Right. And so to me, that's one of the reasons why I'm intrigued with Todd Desmond and his psyche and singularity. I sure don't buy into all of it. I know that up front. I can tell already. It's like, no, I don't think we're God's subconscious mind, and that we're the dark side of God working itself out and God's trying to integrate it. I don't buy into that. I do think Jung had some profound insights, but I think he was profoundly wrong on at least a few things that were important to him. But still, so this guy, this Todd Desmond is bringing together like Hegel. He's bringing Jung's friendship with what was his name? One of the primary founders of quantum physics and mechanics. He had a close Pauli is his last name, and he had this close relationship. Actually, wrote a book, I think, about several dreams that Paulie had, and so it's like getting this weird, convergence of these various, Plato, Hegel. He's just bringing it all, and there's finding a deeper underlying unity of insight that I think can offer us a lot. And if Paul can quote from the pagan poets, I don't know why I can't quote from Jung.
Yeah.
So I don't agree with everything Jung says, but he says some things like the archetype of the self in his book Aeon. The archetype of the self is Christ. It's like, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm sure he didn't mean it as literally in some sense or as ontologically as I do, but still, I think it is an insight. So, yeah, these things are, to me, they're hopeful. There are slippery slopes. We can't just enter into them and just say, "Oh, well, all this is true." But still, I think we can garner and appreciate what truth.
Yeah, I think all the interesting stuff for the future. One way you could use as a litmus test. I think it's always going to be cross disciplinarian. Even like somebody like John Vervaeke, cognitive science. That's essentially what that is. It's a attempt to formalize a cross disciplinary approach to something. So I do think anything that's going to be generative moving forward is going to be much more in the vein of trying to combine things together. And if you think about like where things have been historically, back to that analogy of like the telescope or the microscope, it's always been about finer grain resolutions within a specific area. And I feel like we've taken that to its logical dead end, and that's why we've been bumping our head against this wall for a while. And now what's happening is people are kind of turning around and going and say, oh, there's this, we can actually take things we've learned from here and here and here and point them together. And that's more interesting to have this wider vision. I think we're going to see more and more people, and there's going to be like, a lot of, nonsense that comes out of it too. But, I think, I do think that's what we're going to see more and more of.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I've really enjoyed this, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me again today, and I hope we can continue to do as much as possible in the future. And again, I thank everybody that's been watching. I know it's only been a handful, but I appreciate it. And I've been amazed at how many people actually do go back and watch the recorded, live stream. It's really been encouraging to see that. Dr. Andy, thank you for being here. I see your comment, and I so appreciate your feedback, and your comments have been very encouraging to me. But yeah, we'll bring it to a close for now. And Lord willing, I'll hope to get basically had the next part. I just decided to shorten my last presentation, and then I'm going to kind of resume with looking again back at Lewis's story and trying to kind of take that apart a little bit, and also maybe addressing one important thing that I think Lewis left out. But we'll see how that goes.
Yeah,
But
I look
thanks,
forward to that.
thank you, and I'll let you go, and we'll talk soon, I hope.
Sounds great. Thanks, Wayne, for the invitation.
Okay, see you later. Bye bye.